we'll be beginning with the session.
We are building something in the agri-tech space, combining technology with farming. In the beginning, we got
So
a
hope you
grant
have
that helped us get
had
off
a
the
good
ground.
lunch. So
But now we are at a
post-lunch
stage
session
where we
would
need
be
serious capital to
on the
build,
universal
hire, and
basic
scale.
income, strengthening social protection and reducing poverty. And this session will be moderated by Ms. Pankuri Shah, who's the co-founder of Project Deep. And the panelists for this sessions would be Ms. Sunaina Kumar, Director and Senior Fellow, Observer Research Foundation, Pallavi Srivastav, co-founder of ProGap, Varun Agarwal, founder of Change Engine. So may I request the panelists and the moderator to please come ahead to the stage as we begin.
Stepping into this space for the first time has been overwhelming. There is no playbook. There were moments when I questioned whether some
Commence with this session. The objective of this discussion would be to lay out the importance of UBI, which is a universal basic income, and avenues of making its future evolution more impactful. So the way we'll run the session is to discuss about some of the challenges, solutions, and the way forward. Pankuri, the stage is yours.
Businesses that often go unseen, but are too vital to be ignored. For over 3 decades, SIDBI has not just funded them, it has built the very institutions that support them.
They understood our vision, not just the product we are building, but the market we are targeting and the long-term potential behind it. And at our most critical stage, when we not just needed capital, but for someone to believe in us, SIDBI stepped in.
सिडबी ने बस मेरी बात ही नहीं सुनी, बल्कि मुझे भरोसा दिखाया और इस दिशा में मेरे साथ खड़े रहे। और तभी मैंने फैसला लिया कि मैं अपनी मैन्युफैक्चरिंग यूनिट को इको फ्रेंडली बनाऊंगा। उन्होंने बात समझी और फिर मुझे सही फाइनेंसिंग और गाइडेंस देकर इस बदलाव को हकीकत बनाया।
पहिल्यांदाच खरंच कोणीतरी असं ज्याला आमच्यासारख्या व्यावसायिक
Hello.
सोलर का महत्त्वाचं आहे.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for making it to a post-lunch session. We'll try our best to make it engaging, and we'll definitely keep some room for audience questions at the end. Like Sarthak mentioned, the objective of this session is to really understand universal basic income and its context in India, like where are we today and what do we really look forward to make this movement intentional going forward. In India, we've seen that the first kind of mention of basic income in a big way happened in 2017 when there was a whole chapter dedicated in the economic survey to basic income. It spoke about both the case for and against UBI. And in my opinion, that debate continues to remain relevant even today. Not much has changed. Those who are for UBI speak about the benefits of poverty alleviation, social justice, agency. And those who are still skeptical talk about the same issues of moral conscientiousness, laziness, and linking wage to work. What has changed, though, is the scenario, the kind of challenges that we're dealing with as a country in the social realm. We have job uncertainty. Climate crisis is on the peak and only likely to go up. Like the shocks that people witness are enough to push people back into poverty. And of course, the geopolitical situation is also very uncertain, which impacts people in very different ways. We do need a solution that can not just be a safety net, which protects people from slipping into poverty, but also kind of creates that trampoline effect which propels people upwards. And cash programming, whether UBI or in any other form, does have the potential to do that. We have seen in the decades since the economic survey that Indian policymakers have picked up cash transfers in a big way, right? Unconditional transfers. What I mean by unconditional transfers are some of the schemes that you may have already heard of. PM Kisan, that is providing money directly to farmers thrice a year. Or some of the women-centric schemes that we keep hearing of, Lado Lakshmi Yojana, Ladki Behen, and we have about 14 states that are doing these schemes. This actually culminates into 280,000 crore of budgets being allocated to cash transfers, which is a huge amount. These budgets exceed the amounts being spent on food security and on Narega, which have been the flagship programs for the government for a long time. What we are going to discuss in today's session is really what are the challenges that continue to persist as we think of social protection and welfare, what role can cash programming play in this, and how does the way forward look for us in this space? And I'm very excited to have a very great set of panelists in this discussion with me. So what I'll do is I'll quickly start off and bring others into the conversation. Given that cash programming in the country is currently very much towards women, we see that the total budget allocation, 55% of that is for basic income for women. I'll first bring in Sunaina to speak a little bit about some of the social and political challenges, like challenges to inclusion of women that continue to persist, and really what role does cash transfers play? What is some of the emerging evidence that we're seeing of the programs that have already been implemented in India?
Thank you, Pankuri, and good afternoon to everyone. You've done a great job of setting the context of the last decade or so since the idea of the UBI was proposed in the economic survey. And I think one of the interesting things that came out at that time was that while the economic survey argued for and against the case for a UBI, the middle ground that was suggested even then was a UBI for women, which would, of course, decrease the fiscal cost of it and also ensure that women who also have multiplier effects on households, families, and economies can benefit from it. And one of the things that it acknowledged even then, and that actually remains fundamental to why states are introducing UBI directed at women, is the fact of women's extreme economic marginalization from the Indian economy. And I think that is something in which, it is something which is well cited. Every one of us is aware of the fact that in India, despite growing literacy, growing urbanization, we've not been able to convert that into employment benefits for women. And that is perhaps why this has been, apart from the fact that introducing cash transfers is politically very appealing, the fact that women voters have emerged as the biggest bloc in Indian states and national elections. And that, of course, is a trend which is also contradictory, because while women as voters are increasingly very important, but women's participation in politics still remains extremely marginalized. But if we go back to the economic part of it, the fact that Indian women especially face the greatest burden of time poverty, the kind of care work that they have to do, also left out of formal workforce, for all of the social gendered barriers that we are talking about, has led to a situation where the poverty of burden is also greater on Indian women than men. And from all of that is where we are in a situation where even subsistence level transfers that we are seeing from a range of rupees 1,000 to 2,500 across states can make a lot of difference. And one of the arguments around UBI has always been that does it actually disincentivize people from working? But it does not. It is always an additive where it is something that helps you get past some, and especially in these days of growing economic uncertainty, in the post-COVID landscape of climate crisis, these monthly amounts which are regular, which are direct, and which are individualized for women can make a huge difference. Do I have a minute more to go over the impacts, or would you want to say? Okay, so you also asked about what are we seeing in terms of emerging evidence from states on impacts. I think those are multifaceted, and I'm pretty sure that we will cover more of those in the course of this discussion. But first and foremost, of course, has been, and I know that this is something, Pankuri, that you also in Project Deep have covered, looking at effects on consumption. So household consumption, and that money for cash transfers being used for food, for nutrition, so improving food security of households, for women to buy cooking gas, cooking oil, using that money for medicines, and then of course then directing it towards education and health as well. And those are some of the things. What we're not seeing so far is how do we also ensure that these amounts are used for savings and further for credit, something that Pallavi, I'm sure, can address. But again, impacts range across. I think the most this is universally seen in countries across the world, but also in India, that women's decision making. So a survey from Karnataka, for example, West Bengal, states that have been running these programs for the past couple of years, show the effect on decision making in households where women, of course, get to decide how money is spent. It is, the surveys show that 99% of women have full control. For example, one from Karnataka. And also, interestingly, they also then have a greater say on how the husband's earnings are spent in a household. So that is another. There is, of course, impact on savings, on financial inclusion, and on addressing the care burden and time poverty aspects. I'm now going to trot this along and maybe come back to this later in the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sunaina, for really covering the range of both challenges, but also where all cash transfers play a role. I'll take a moment to also share, that global evidence also echoes some of what, Sunaina has mentioned, because, and one of the questions that you raised on savings and credit, right? One of the largest UBI pilots being run by Abhijit Banerjee and Give Directly actually shows that those that are receiving basic income as monthly payments actually pool it into a ROSCA to be able to trade it in for a lump sum. And there are definitely a lot of innovations in India possible for the same. As an organization, we kind of implement lump sum pilots, and we have seen the immense impact that can have on asset creation. So a family being able to build a house, having secure housing, having leveled land, or having more access to water proximate to your house, definitely significantly changes economic outcomes and quality of life. We started off the program saying that the gender lens should be to provide conduct the transfers in the women's bank account. But what we're seeing is that all of the avenues where money is used actually addresses the point on time poverty that you raised. A woman not having to walk 3 kilometers to get water every day for every single need of theirs, having that water source close to their house, really addresses that point quite clearly. The point on disincentivizing of work also has been studied extensively globally. There are specific studies that show that labor force participation does not get impacted negatively. In fact, if it does, the reason is that people are able to opt for higher studies or start their own entrepreneurship ventures. At this point, I would like to kind of bring in Pallavi to speak about, what does MSMEs in India really look like? Like being able to start up your own venture, one of the biggest sort of hurdles is capital access. And where do you see, what do you see the challenges in this journey with a specific lens on capital access, and then whether debt is actually a stressor or an enabler in some of these situations?
Sure. So I run a fintech company which is into providing credit to micro, small and medium enterprises. And like we know, out of the 63 million MSMEs in India, 90% are micro enterprises, right? And I think when we look at this segment of entrepreneurs, they are not founders who are willing to build a business out of ambition, or your typical Silicon Valley founders or tech founders. They are people who are not doing this by choice but because of compulsion, right? And the compulsion is that there is, of course, if you look at the last decade, the real wage has only hardly increased. I think it's almost zero. If you would be able to address that better. But I think just the fact that one is so prone, and we see this in our work every day, these customers, and I always say this across, that MSMEs are hugely creditworthy. It is just that the lens with which we look at them is very different, right? The way the traditional banks look at them and actually mark them as non-creditworthy is primarily because they don't have a way to evaluate them. These guys will not have the right kind of data, the documentation that can enable them to access credit. They don't have that kind of financial backing or background. So one shock of any nature, whether it is COVID, whether it is climate related, whether it is financial, health related, completely wipes off and shakes the entire family. So we joke about this internally that this is when we look at the balance sheets to do the underwriting and credit assessment. We often say that this is not a business P&L, it's a household P&L, because it's the same income through which they are paying the rent, funding the child's education, taking care of medical needs. So it's so vulnerable. I was reading this very interesting book called as Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and it does talk about how a very optimistic view of the world, where you see that actually the world is not in such a bad shape. The poverty has come down drastically from 90% to sub 10%, and then he classifies the poverty levels into level 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have crossed the barrier of level 1. So we are at a level 2 and 3, but then that segment is extremely vulnerable to one shock. And I think even when we look at credit default, sometimes we are finding it very hard to ask for repayment because we feel so empathetic and really connected to the problem at hand, where they just don't have a way to come out of it. I truly believe that looking at the work that you all are doing and with UBI, I feel that at least will give everybody a level through which they can operate in and really think about growth and ambition and not just survival. So personally, I strongly believe that nobody should live in abject poverty. People should have life of dignity. They should have basic income. They should have ambition and means and joy to actually build something and be a part of this economy that's booming, right? We all talk about the GDP numbers, but the moment we look at GDP per capita, we are at a abysmally low level. So there's a lot of work to be done, and 63 million MSMEs can be a large contributor to the GDP and the economy. Current contribution is about 30%, leading to 110 million jobs. I think this, for any developed economy, this number is somewhere about 50%. So we got to bridge that gap, and if we really want to think about, from Nandan Nilekani, the speech that he made a few months ago about this, how can we do that, can bring that 7 trillion, 6 trillion ambition to 8 trillion, MSMEs do have a strong role to play. So I think that UBI can actually provide that cushion for some of these external shocks, so they can be on good credit behavior and be able to match the cash flow cycles. Also, one last thing, if I can add, the way the traditional financial institutions are designing products for MSME customers are driven by a very predictable cash flow on a monthly EMI payments, but their incomes don't work like that, right? It's a very erratic. You will buy, like at least for the traders and shopkeeper segment we work with, they will buy an inventory, they will then sell off, then there'll be cycle, there's seasonality, Diwali will have a better season, then there is agri cycle, so different industries have different cash flow cycles. And when you design financial products, when it comes to credit specifically, it needs to take into account those cash flows, I think. So there's a lot of work to be done, and can be a huge, impetus if banks start to think of, and financial institutions come to think of MSME credit in a more product-led and segment-led way, rather than having one kind of product across. So that's where my position would be on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you touched upon a couple of interesting points, right? One, that people are almost forced into occupations that they might not have been their first choice, and then amongst the struggle of dealing with that, credit and capital access becomes one that is so strong that it not only affects the business but also household incomes and financial resilience. I think the point on cash flow cycles is very interesting. Like as it applies to MSMEs, also applies to individuals, right? Because it's an absolute parallel for me when I think about when we work with citizens and look at the poverty pyramid. There is, a little bit of conversation on graduation approach or direct programming, where there's in-kind transfers and skilling support that's provided, and then the next layer is directly microfinance. So the same challenges that you've been speaking about in terms of MSMEs is very directly related to individuals as well. Those who need credit for more routine usage or not usage that enables an increase in cash flow also opt for microfinance. And at first go, it is difficult to repay. There's 25% interest rate on an average, which can go much higher. But if there is a shock, like you mentioned, that just gets compounded more and really leaves very little room for aspirations, very little room for productive investment in themselves. What you also very interestingly mentioned and gave me a great segue is about participating in the economy, right? This conference and a lot of the conversations in our country are about inclusive growth, right? Like as we talk about Viksit Bharat, how do you make sure that all citizens are able to participate and also benefit from this growth that we are seeing? And that has been a large agenda for the government as well. And at that point, I would like to bring you in, Varun, to say that, we've seen welfare evolve. We've seen it started with direct programming, subsidies, now cash transfers. Really, what are some of the challenges that continue to persist in the way that delivery of welfare is currently being done? And, what are the opportunities that you see or the role of cash programming in this space?
No, thank you. Thanks, Pankudi, for having me. No, so I think, India has been doing welfare for very, very long. And maybe that's the good news and the bad news, because we have just so many schemes now, right? And a lot of them have been created at different times and by different ministries, and they exist in silos, right? In recent context, we were looking for schemes for caregivers, right? People who leave care facilities. And there are schemes which exist till we say that, which is what, 200 rupees per year to be given to caregivers, right? So there are a variety of legacy schemes which are there, which have not been sunset. There's distortions which happens due to schemes when the same schemes, the same household accesses multiple schemes, right? So when you were talking about the question of would cash make people lazy, probably cash will not make them lazy because it is minimum income. But if they're getting 5 different subsidies to the same household, then probably it could make them lazy, right? So there is no, what I would say is, and I and you have discussed this, Pankhudi, before, but it needs that a state needs a welfare policy, because there are different kinds of schemes which are for different purposes and for different target groups, right? And that was the discussion which is happening in this group as well, that there's some schemes which is for smoothing your income and making sure you have stuff for day-to-day life. Ayushman Bharat is a very different scheme, right? Which is saying that if you have a health shock, you can take care of that health shock in a family, right? So there are a variety of insurance schemes which could be there. And then there are schemes which lead to economic growth, right? Like giving credit is something which we see that more credit leads to economic growth. And then, of course, some of these schemes also focus on women, which we have discussed, and making sure they have more participation in both social and economic decision making. So the way I think about it is that we have to think of it as a welfare stack, where there, as examples, these 3 different objectives: smoothing of income, shocks, making sure you can overcome shocks. Then it is economic growth, right? Like your Project Deep has advocated for lump sum transfers leading to more economic growth. Right? Which is a very, very interesting idea. So when you give small pieces of money every month, it is smoothing consumption. But when you are giving larger sums, it is like renting some area for agriculture and so on and so forth. So I think what we really need to do is that, the way I envision it at least, is that states need a welfare policy where they're saying that these are our welfare objectives, and then figure out that what are different schemes which lead to different objectives. Another thing which, again, we have discussed in the past is that you can give cash, but if there is lack of public infrastructure in health and education at that place, it would not pay dividends, right? अगर अच्छे school नहीं है तो क्या करेंगे? Cash का, it will not lead to education outcomes. So I think we have to see, maybe, I've said many different things, but the idea is that you have to see welfare cohesively, right? And you cannot say, so to your question at the beginning, that do we need universal basic income? I think the answer to that is that it is probably necessary but not sufficient, right? And you need other schemes at variety of levels, because you would want that probably at some point it is no more necessary either, right? Though of course we're in a world where technology and everything is changing too fast and inequality is rising, so we cannot predict what would happen. But the ideal outcome is that we would want more and more people in productive work and being able to, use that to live a decent life. So if we can create this symphony of schemes, which we cannot say ki we only need economic growth, so forget about smoothing consumption right now. We have to smoothen consumption. We cannot keep waiting for economic growth, and but we have to smoothen it in the short term, create economic gains. The other is also not right that we keep smoothing it. So I think that's the way I look at it. That have a welfare policy, have a welfare stack, and the government should be courageous to sunset schemes, right? And make sure they are not distorted. Many schemes are also distorted. So one example we took where there was so little money which was being given. There are other schemes like electric subsidy, where it has been studied that only 10% of it goes to the needy, right? 90% of it goes to people who may probably don't need it. So I think, but once a subsidy is given, it's hard to take back. So my hope is that more states would look at welfare cohesively and say what are their targets for the state, and then develop a set of subsidies based on that and sunset what is not needed.
No, thank you, Varun. I think the two things that, kind of I'll use to summarize what you're saying is, A is the science of welfare, right? Like how do you define the objectives and then build a balanced programming across, and the key word being balanced, because I think the polarization often happens across economic growth and freebies, and honestly that's really the conversation needs to move away from that to see how do you actually build that balance between the two. And you mentioned about electricity subsidies, and because we started talking about economic survey, there was also a chapter that spoke extensively about phasing out fertilizer subsidies. In fact, the economic survey chapter on UBI also speaks about phasing out of PDS, fertilizer, and of course it needs to be relooked at in terms of whether it's relevant today, how it can be done. But again, goes back to the whole point on cohesion. Like if one family is needing to access 6 different schemes only for maintaining their basic life, like lifestyle, which is like food and then housing and then basic income, that's cumbersome both at the citizen level and at the administrative level, but also very, very effort intensive. And so really like the idea of a welfare stack, which is in fact something that we're working together on as well to build out. Just to give an example on what, that came to mind when Varun was speaking, is that the number of schemes, just to give a context, is that Maharashtra has over 2,000 welfare schemes, right? Can you imagine an organization trying to run 2,000 products? It's really not possible. And that's one of the reasons that we have schemes that are speaking about 200 rupees to citizens, which is not very relevant today. Even if you look at the monthly per capita expenses, 200 rupees doesn't really fit anywhere. We've had had an opportunity to look at both the citizen lens and the government lens in terms of what are the challenges and what are some of, we've already touched upon what are some of the ideas that could kind of be used going forward. But I'll just like to double click on the forward-looking lens from a couple of perspectives, right? Where, as we talk about UBI, I think one of the big questions is where can the money come from? What is a good design? To what Varun said, like how do you actually balance consumption and investment focus? And really what is the last mile? I mean, the DBT, the introduction of the DBT mission and the shift to DBT schemes has really solved for a lot of the access issues because you're reaching the citizens directly. But the last mile, the last 10-20% who are in fact the most vulnerable often get left out. Does technology have a role to play? Is there some more innovation? Can we actually leverage some of the existing grassroots schemes that are working well? So just from the lens of very quickly thinking about the way forward, I would like to invite all of you. I know you've touched upon it, but if you could just share 2 instances that come to your mind that would make the move to UBI or to a more cohesive welfare, if I were to zoom out, make it more intentional and impactful. If you could share some, like 2 ideas that you would think.
Yeah, so essentially, taking this forward from what Varun said and you said, Pankuri, of the welfare stack, I think one is the fact that we need what we're even having today, which is a discussion, more civil society participation, so that, the monitoring frameworks where the all of society approach, so that government has this policy in place. It is also everyone's role then to ensure that that we first of all are making sure that these programs are responsive to the needs of beneficiaries. I'm sort of focusing on women here because women somehow are the largest beneficiaries so far. So that, if we have already achieved stage 1 and we are providing these transfers, then how can we address questions of last mile and convergence? So speaking of last mile, and this of course also takes us back to the conversation that we have on, how India's digital financial inclusion trajectory started with the JAM Trinity, and how despite all of the gains, and those have been tremendous gains of course, there are still some gaps, and some of those gaps actually also involve a large part of our population in rural areas and also women. So that India also has the largest number of dormant bank accounts according to so many surveys, right? And those are operated by women. So how do we ensure that women are able to have access to digital and financial literacy? And that is not just for withdrawal purposes, because most surveys will point out that they are using these transfers only to withdraw the money and then of course to spend it, which is great. It boosts the local economy, it helps the household, family, all of that. But how do we then ensure, and again something that Pallavi also works on, that there is further convergence with accessing credit, with insurance, all of that. So that is one part of last mile, essentially just helping women. First, of course, banking agents has been something that we know has proven to be successful, but access to technology, but also literacy part of it. There are programs that India has which have been so successful, and just to bring up the most obvious one would be the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which has ensured that women at the grassroots are collectivized and mobilized in every nook and corner of the country. And under NRLM, which is like a staggeringly huge program, because of course it is run in every state under the State Rural Livelihoods Mission, how can we ensure that this is again not silos, what you have been speaking about, that if we're already providing a universal basic income or a form of it through cash transfers, then can we also tap into converging it with programs like Employment Guarantee, which is NREGA, soon to be renamed, and also of course NRLM, to ensure that even if women can pool in, let's say, small amounts of their savings, and we're seeing in states across the country, from Tamil Nadu, Assam, West Bengal, that if a woman is getting, let's say on an average 2,000 in her account, and let's say about 1,500 goes into just expenses of running the household, so can those 300-400 that are left go into self-help groups. And then if so many women in a group can do that together, then that collectivization, can they then convert that into buying more farm implements? And they're doing some of that, starting micro enterprises. But how can it be done with policy support? They are doing it at an individual level, but how can we ensure that they do it, and the right sort of policy environment for it could include sort of optional, not forced, but optional ways of skilling, of employment, of savings, of improving their literacy, financial literacy. So I think these are the things that we now need to start seeing more intentionally.
No, absolutely. I think convergence both at welfare but also at a ground level, because when we know what works, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? Like, we just need to make sure that it runs more seamlessly and is connected with every new kind of idea that comes up. But I'll pass on to.
So last mile access, given that we operate a fintech, so I'll look at it from a tech background, and I think we spoke about that, and you had given me some homework in the morning. I did do some work on that. So essentially, I think the fact that we are able to today talk about UBI is primarily on the basis of the groundwork that's already been done in terms of Jam Trinity, UPI transactions. We're in terms of access, and we are definitely an example for many countries out there in terms of how we've been able to deliver this at scale. So I don't think access is a big problem, but like Pankuri, you rightly said, exclusion is. And what do you do with those leftover, remaining, most needy 10, 15, 20%? And I did go back to think about how we are reaching out to the last mile, because our customer base is entirely on tier 3 towns and below. And obviously, to Pankuri's point, it did make me think that how you're figuring out when eKYC fails, right? And that happens to our customer base all the time. So we've figured out multiple ways of authentication, right? So you have CKYC, then you have, you can use your email, you can use your phone number, you can do biometrics. So there are multiple ways of authentication. Second is, how do you create, we have a very quick helpline in terms of, and we do work with millions of customers, right? So we are able to immediately, through a call center of just 20 people, are able to address any issue real time, right? So technology can enable that. We've been able to make Aadhaar, we have set up those Aadhaar desks to make the identity system reach out to the last mile in every single individual. We can set up maybe the BC model that banks deploy, or self-help groups, or post offices. In our case, we do have people on the ground, but then we work with the distributor ecosystem that then goes ahead and does assisted onboarding and KYC. So a large part of it has to be assisted for the first time inclusion. And instead of thinking of it as a fancy app, if I look at our app, the color, the font size, it's as simplistic as it gets. Like, it just gets the work done, right? So I think you got to think about design in that way. So from that respect, I think technology can solve it through design, through figuring out how you actually reach out to the most excluded and marginalized. It's more of a design problem than I would say, and it's a solvable problem in my view. The second one, I think you mentioned 2 points, right? Could be about ensuring, because the trust will only come, and the account usage, to Sunaina's point, happens when there is a constant transaction happening, right? So again, with use of technology, you can build cadence of timely, just like a salary payout, right? On a day when the money will be transferred, there is predictability, and that's what leads to trust. And then I think the final thing, if I can add, is just the sheer amount of data that you end up getting by doing this, where it's failing, where people are not getting access, right? You can just pull out and keep on improving and having those feedback loops to create a more efficient system and more useful system, and then be able to figure out where exactly is the money going, where you need to do more work, which regions, which geos, which segments. And I think that's a very powerful way to use technology to drive the next level of unlock. So those would be my 3 things.
Amazing. I think I loved what you said about this being a solvable problem. I think that's what we see, those with more like, an innovative mindset, like corporates working with the government, is where we see a lot of innovation coming in, because there is a certain status quo or a certain lens that government policy design has. And a lot of time we see that this innovation or this, real kind of thrust to figure out what's not being able to figure out comes from such ideas. And it's great that you've already been able to do it at scale, which means that it is possible to take it forward. So thank you for sharing that. I really enjoyed listening to it, and pass on to Varun.
Just adding to what Pallavi was saying, I think access is a problem not only for UBI but other subsidy schemes as well, right? And that's why we see so many non-profits which just work on getting access of schemes to people. And part of it is, that the data/technology, there's a problem with the data/technology backbone in the government. Let's say there's a scheme and there are XYZ criteria for qualifying for that scheme. and you go through that process. Now there's another scheme where probably there's 60% overlap of the criteria. Again, you have to go back from scratch, right? So there's the systems don't talk at the back end, which if they start talking can create a lot of efficiency. So if that can be done at the back end, and I think Pallavi said a lot of right things on developing technology for last mile. I'd just like to add that we should use now the power of AI, right? Because voice recognition is solved, image recognition is solved, a lot of these things are solved, right? So pretty much there can be very, very smart chatbots which are audio, multilingual, and so on, which could even give you feedback, right? Like if you take a photo of your Aadhaar card and it is cut from some side, it can say ki it is cut, aap phir se kariye, phir se wo kariye. So it can become more human-like in its interaction, and I think that can be a huge leverage point. And what I have generally seen is that the governments are interested in such solutions because more and more what they see is that if they can get public service to individuals, that helps them get votes. So there is interest in making these things easier. So that would be my one point. I think there's a disruption which has come in the last few years in AI and technology. I think we are just at the tip of the iceberg of how this can be used. And I'm not saying this irresponsibly in the way many people think AI is a solution for everything. I'm saying it very responsibly because I would not say this for education, that use AI. For education, I mean, you should. I don't think it's the silver bullet to solve India's primary education problem or foundational learning problem, but I think it can be a silver bullet for distribution of public services. On the second piece, I like to say that there's this thing around measurement of impact, which is done extremely poorly, right? So when we are talking about symphony of schemes and welfare science and all of it, they're all great words till someone in the government is saying that we are measuring impact every quarter or every year, and then based on it, redoing the schemes in the right way because, I know there's a lot of global evidence there, a lot of RCTs and so on. RCTs are highly contextual, and they fail when you put them in the context. So I think those systems need to be developed to say that, I think in the first part of the conversation, we talked about it from a theoretical point of view. I think that needs to be augmented with an empirical point of view of what it is leading to. And I think from there, again, this point which Pankhuri we have talked about is that there's still a huge amount of room for innovation and design of instruments, right? So we have talked about cash plus, right? The good thing about cash is that it is so low friction, so easy to give and so on, as opposed to a graduation approach, which is so high friction. But no one's saying that there's nothing in between these two things where you can, there's again data which shows that certain kinds of training, etc., which is given even on phone, etc., can make that use of cash more intentional, right? So I think, and that is again very, very closely linked with measurement, right? So I think those will be the 2 points I would like to make about measurement and experimentation with schemes, and the other one is to harness technology in a greater way.
Yeah. No, thank you, Varun. I think it's, listening to ideas always brings hope, and not like abstract hope, but real tangible ideas that can be put out in the real world. I think it brings to mind the recent study that Karthik Muralidharan has done with cash transfers, which actually did use technology support to boost nutrition outcomes. So it was an unconditional transfer program. So there were no conditions, there was no precondition to receive it and no condition to use it. But it was augmented by voice messages on what good health and nutrition can look like. And they did see that that kind of labeling also actually works. So tying up the two things, right, that you could use technology for innovation in a frictionless manner and at the same time measure the outcomes to be able to see really what's working and how it's working. Like sometimes we know what's working, but we don't really know how. Like what lever can you change and that will significantly improve or reduce the results. So I think one of the things we've been realizing is that the how, like what is the mechanism of the change, is something that is very rarely spoken about and needs a lot of doubling down on. I'll pause here and see if there are any questions from the audience before we wrap up.
Actually, while that happens, I wanted to quickly, just to add to what you were saying about label cash transfers and what Karthik Muralidharan has done as a pilot study. SAM, which is one of the pioneers of starting cash transfers, right? It introduced it in 2020, and that's where this whole wave of cash transfer started. It's still the only state which actually has label cash transfers, which is a behavioral nudge. But to go back to the question of monitoring and evaluation, I don't think I've seen very detailed studies on understanding how is the labeled versus unlabeled really working. And that's where those are the things that we need to see. Over to you, Sabina.
Hi, such an interesting discussion. I just had one query at the top of my head and I'm just asking it out loud here. So you just mentioned like a state like Maharashtra having around 2,000 schemes, right? Welfare schemes. So in the context of a country like India, where even the policies are run both by the center and the state, and at the same time there is a host of policies that are there, sometimes similar with a lot of overlap, right? So how do you, like, even within the most vulnerable and marginalized, how do you make this cash transfers more equitable for these particular segments that you talked about? Like, essentially that has been the target so far for the universal cash transfers, is mostly like the underprivileged or the marginalized of the marginalized, right? And then the problem of access, rightly pointed out, maybe like, me accessing a bank account is not a problem, but rather like how I use this money. Does the panel have any insight on how these cash transfer has been used? Because just by the experience of doing so many surveys in India and looking at how women utilize the money that goes to them, it is more than often that it is spent on household requirements and needs than on herself and her aspirations, which anyways come secondary for this particular gender that we're talking about, right? So 2 questions. One is like, how do you make it more equitable amongst this particular segment? And second is like, any insights on the usage of these cash transfers that happen to the women?
So I think the equity lens, and I'll invite others to chip in as well. I think there are 2 contrasting responses that I have, right? The equity lens, us as an organization looks at, location-specific factors or social factors that actually determine both the vulnerability and the impact of any program, cash transfers. And then there's a lot of nuance that can be built into programming to make it equitable. But at the same time, when you talk about government programs, the simpler the better, right? The minute it gets complex, you're faced with the same challenges of implementation and reach. So the equity lens is a tricky one. One sort of paper again of Karthik Muralidharan that comes to mind is where he's proposed an inclusive growth dividend. And this has been spoken about multiple times by other economists as well, which is to say that there is one base level, like everyone getting one amount of cash transfers at the base, which is the safety net, and then any nuances that bring about equity kind of get built on top of that. It's a larger vision, but I think that in India, like we said, multiple schemes have been introduced by different people for different contexts, so not completely unimaginable, right? You do have schemes specifically for tribal groups, specifically for care leavers, which is actually a much smaller population. You have, in Andhra Pradesh, you have scheme for fisher folk as well. So we do see that after a base, there is possible to build onto that to make that foundation even stronger. Not sure if that addresses your question, but that's a bit of...
I just had I wanted to understand equity better. Are you talking about equity of outcomes, or in what way are you understanding equity, right? Is it that everyone should get the same money, or more vulnerable people should get more money and so on? But what is your lens to equity, just to understand it better?
The outcomes part of it, right? Because that's a lot on like how people are using it, and efficiently if there are interventions targeting on particular outcome, like she mentioned, nutrition driven outcomes or so. But at the supply side, when I am actually looking at as a provider of universal basic income to the people of my country, how do I make it more incomeable so that it doesn't, for example, there's a sort of overlap, right? So I get, suppose in Assam, Sunaina mentioned, like it's the Arunodaya scheme. I will also get the Ujjwala scheme maybe. I will also get, XYZ. And there is no proper mechanism of tracking that, how equitably it is being distributed or concentrated in clusters or in households. So question was mostly around.
No, I think that's clearer. But I think, yeah, that's exactly, I think, was the point when we were talking about trying to create a symphony, and it is hard, right? Because it is, I mean, within a state, the state government can still do some planning, which is also hard because ministries don't talk to each other all the times. But when the center and the state kind of comes into play, then it kind of becomes harder. But I think you guys have tried to do some of this work in Maharashtra, right? Like looking at a household level and what all they are receiving. Yeah.
Yeah, so two responses, and thank you for asking that question, Varun. So what we're doing, there are two ways to look at this, right? What we're doing in Maharashtra is actually looking at the schemes of all the big departments to understand the overlap in the description or in the intention behind the scheme itself, and you will find that in a huge number. Like the state itself has, for example, 9 overlapping schemes only on housing. How do you actually consolidate that? Easier said than done, but at least it develops an understanding of where the overlaps are and why they exist. Another interesting thing that is happening in the country is the household ID. I think the idea of the household ID is being promoted with this exact intention to understand how many schemes are being penetrated within a particular household to identify both inclusion and exclusion. Because sometimes you could be having like a woman who is from 50, like turning 60, so she loses the benefits from the woman-based scheme, but she should ideally start getting pension. Are we able to actually track that? So the household ID has many used cases. Many states are further ahead in the implementation of household ID while others are not. But I think it's a great idea which has the potential to understand the life cycle of benefits, right? Right from, we have many schemes for girl child or children education in general, and right up to pensions. How are we able to track like the seamless transition between schemes and also the movement out of poverty? We don't want to keep serving the same families forever, right? Like you do want to see them graduate outside poverty at some point. So you want to take the second one?
Very quickly, and maybe you can also chime in on that because you've had experience through pilot studies on lump sum transfers, and the utilization of those in households would be very different from the monthly transfers. But all of the surveys, or the detailed ones that any of us would have scanned, seem to imply, and actually I was trying to pull out one which specifically answered, and I couldn't find the data right now, but I think in either Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, they've done a survey to look at the percentage that is being directed for women's own, like outside of household, for her own leisure, beauty, or any other needs. And there are some who do spend it, but it's a very small proportion of women who are. And that might have to do with the fact that these are monthly small transfers, so that very little is left outside of the immediate expenses. But as far as lump sums are concerned, and I'm not sure if the effects there are different.
Yeah, so with lump sum, the objective of the lump sum is that, it has the potential to either help families achieve a big aspiration or alleviate a big stressor. And that typically is in the form of asset creation, right? So we see both security assets and livelihood assets. From our programs, we've seen about 89% of the money goes into asset building. The lens on what women want or prioritizing their own needs, there are two ways I look at it. One is that if there is no roof, if there's no proper roof in your house, then it's not a question really of gender. You do really need that to keep your family safe, to be safe yourself. But it does disproportionately affect a woman because men typically migrate to work. And so women, and it is beneficial from the lens of women, similar to the example I was stating about the borewell as well. Very anecdotally, we have seen that once the big sort of the big allocation has happened, whether it is housing or livelihood. If there is a buffer amount that is left, then you see women really being able to prioritize themselves. We have stories, very, very simple stories. One that has stayed with me is of a woman who simply bought a sari after many years. She said, I have children, I have a husband, I have a family, and typically money, that's where all the sort of non-necessary spending goes. And this is the first time, because the money was in my account and there was some amount left over, I was able to kind of prioritize that for myself. So many similar stories that we see of like small instances of them, of women being able to actually think about themselves, and kind of indulge a little bit, if I may say so, but not in a negative way, like just kind of being able to fulfill their everyday wishes. Any more questions? Should I close?
Yes.
Okay, no, thank you. I think it was lovely having this, great conversation with my co-panelists. I think I just want to kind of end to say that UBI was introduced 10 years ago, but continues to really remain relevant, both from an economic and a social lens. Because the reality is that if a large part of our country does not participate in the growth that we're seeing, then it's not just unfair, but it's also not, it doesn't make sense from an economic lens because you're not getting that much participation. And so from both a justice lens and from an economic lens, it does make sense to think of solutions that enable inclusive growth. And there is enough evidence that cash programming and UBI can be that solution. So thank you for participating in this panel.
Great, thanks Pankari for that, and thanks fellow panelists. I think this is a tough nut to crack when it comes to UBI, because there's always a debate between right versus privilege when we talk about UPI. So I think let's hope the convergence, some of the solutions that were discussed here are shared across the government entities, given the fact that only Maharashtra is facing such a big challenge, but if you talk about other states as well, I think they will be having similar challenges as well. So thanks a lot, Pankari, for helping moderating this session, and thanks, panelists. So I think we'll close this session